And I just want to start out by saying, Kevin and I have perspectives on this, but this is truly an unsolved problem at a global scale. There's not a single one of these saline lakes that has been restored after it slipped into decline. And it is just as likely that one of you here at this meeting have the idea of how we can come together as people and solve this problem, be the first community to do it. And so don't downplay any of your thoughts, any of your questions and criticisms. We need to work together on this. I am a college professor by day, and it's the summertime, so I haven't given a quiz in a long time. And I feel a little bit shaky. So there are going to be some quiz questions today, non-rhetorical. How would you define water security? Is that a term that any of you have heard? You could think about financial security as a metaphor.
Stability of snowpack.
Tell me again.
Stability of snowpack.
Okay, so having a good, adequate water supply, right? About 95% of our drinking water comes from snowpack.
So it means we live within our means.
Live within our means. These are not plants in the audience. You hit the two sides of water security. So this is an equation that even an ecologist like me can understand. When supply is greater than demand over a period of time, you've got security, whether that's money coming in and money that you're spending, or whether that's water coming in and water that you're consuming. So how do we get to this place? And I won't quiz you here, because this one's a little bit more complicated. The global water expert Rhett Larson, who I think of, I need to print out a picture of Rhett, because doesn't it just feel like his presence is comforting? You know, we're like, okay, we can do this. It's a three ingredient recipe, and it's listed in order. So number one, understand water. How much do you have sustainably available? Where is it being used? Where is there waste? Number two, conserve water. So identify any of those areas where the water's not being put to the highest best use, which, by the way, has to include the environment, which is our home, right? It's not just the water that we're consuming. Is there enough for the rivers, for the groundwater, for the lake? Eliminate the waste. And number three, after you have maxed out steps 1 and 2, then consider augmenting water. So trying to get more. Now, the reason why these are put in this order is the ones at the top are preventative, proactive, they have co-benefits, right? If you understand where the water is being used, how it's being used, if you've eliminated waste, there's no downside to that. If a farmer figures out how to grow their crops with less water, even if they have the same water right, they can make it through a drought year better. On the other hand, if you're relying on water augmentation, on increasing supply, that is increasingly dangerous. Because if there's a change in how much water is available, if the pipeline breaks down, then you're stuck in a place where you're committed to more water consumption. So this has been learned in the Colorado River. It's been learned in the Indus River Valley, kind of the breadbasket of India and China. It's been learned in the Midwest with the Ogallala Aquifer. Start with understanding, max out conservation, and then augment as little as possible. And so if we look at that equation, I think we need to flip it around. It's the same equation, right? But now we're focused on demand, what Nan said, living within our means. And this is important because when we think about demand, we're talking about changing society. And that's something that's really hard to do, by the way. But it's something that we can do and that we do all the time, for the better. We're not talking about a world in the future of scarcity. We're talking about flourishing within the limits, right? Including in creating a home that we want to live in. And this is also important because for most of the Earth's history, water has flowed downhill, but that's no longer the case. And this is a drawing from one of my favorite hydrological papers by Linton and Budds that's by a 12-year-old girl that shows that water now flows toward money, or more generally toward power. Humans appropriate and consume the equivalent of half of the water that flows from the land to the ocean at a global scale. Imagine that. Half of the entire flow of all of the world's rivers and groundwater is being used for one species, primarily for our food supply. So we dominate the Earth system, and it's very important what we choose. So you now are all global water security experts. If you want to come get a sticker afterwards, you can. Let's apply our understanding to the Great Salt Lake watershed. I love this picture from the International Space Station because you can see the whole watershed. What stands out to you? I don't know how well you can see it. That big white spot, right? That's the West Desert. And you can see the causeway. The reason why the north half of the lake is red is because it doesn't have any surface water flow. So it's so saline that algae can't grow there, only some halophilic bacteria can. So here's where we are today. More than half of the lake's surface area is gone. Almost 2/3 of its water volume is gone. We're 15 feet below where we would be if there weren't human water diversions and consumption. Imagine that. 15 feet. And I've gotten a lot of criticism, I and the whole team of contributors for that 2023 report about this 5-year timeline, and I'm happy to discuss at length what we mean by that, but I think that it is absolutely critical to say we are within just a couple of hot, dry summers of ecological collapse of the lake. And hydrologically, while yes, there still would be some salty puddles, things get harder to stabilize and restore as the lake gets smaller. We'll talk about some of those reasons. So this is what the largest tributary to Great Salt Lake looks like most of the year now. This is a causeway that goes over Bear River Bay. So what is causing this decline? Quiz number 2. I'm going to give you these options. When it's the one you agree with, raise your hand. Who thinks that it's population growth causing this decline? Local water consumption, climate change, drought, data centers. Okay. There are contributions from multiple of these, right? There's the fallacy of the single cause. But this thankfully, is pretty close to a single cause, not exclusively. But local water consumption is driving this issue. And that's good news, right? So if we look at attributing the decline of the lake, about 80% of it is local water use. About 3/4 of that 80% is agricultural, around 20% for cities, and around 5% for industrial water use. Now, the reason why I say this is good news is if this was broad-scale climate change, there'd be very little we could do here locally to reverse the lake's decline. But because we are causing it here in the watershed, it means we can be the solution. Now, we started, when we think about water management here, we started with Water Security Law number 3. What was the third thing we should do? Augment water. We started with our water sustainability and water security in the West with water augmentation. And on the right, you can see this is a graph that shows the total reservoir capacity in the watershed through time, starting in 1895. And at that time, there were already a lot of people, native and immigrant people, in this area. For that initial history, they coexisted. Right? The lake was doing well and the community was growing. They were growing food. In fact, by tonnage of actual food consumed, they were growing more food than we are now. But they weren't growing the same commodity crops at the same scale. And as we increased water supply by building more and more reservoirs, that allowed us to store, divert, and consume more and more water. And so what happens at the end is, does anybody know the last large dam built in our watershed? Jordanelle. So some of you might have remembered when it was, I think, 1993, not that far in the distant past. That marked the end of this big period of building large dams to try to solve these water security issues. Since that time, water consumption has stayed almost perfectly flat, while population has more than doubled. How have we done that? Like, have any of you had the water turned off at your house? Because we were told just a couple decades ago that that was going to happen. Right? If we didn't build more dams and pipelines and canals, we were going to go off a cliff and we wouldn't have water security. How did we do it? So low flush toilets, Conservation, right? We figured out, we have reduced the per capita water consumption dramatically. We've had water neutral growth. The next frontier will be water negative growth, right? Where we're actually consuming less overall, even as the population and economy continue to grow. So I won't belabor this because you just came to a dust forum, so you know why it matters. But I do want to just touch on a few issues of why it matters if the lake dries up. And we don't need an advanced scientific model to know why it matters, because this is a movie that we've seen before. Right? Nearly all of the world's 120 large saline lakes are in decline. And so we can zoom in and look at these time series and see the same thing in the former Soviet Union, in Iran, in Bolivia, in California, in China, right? On every continent, these terminal lakes exist. The first thing that I care about as a hydrologist and as a lifelong Utahn is these lakes control the weather. We sometimes believe that we can control the weather with cloud seeding. I'd love to have that conversation afterwards. No peer-reviewed scientific evidence suggests that cloud seeding works at a large scale. The best that we have is a study that demonstrates that the concept behind it is observable. This is a graph from a recent hydrological paper that shows at 100% precipitation, 100% of the lake area, how much precipitation we get here in the valley. If you go from that to no lake, we lose nearly half of our precipitation. So the difference between Wendover and Salt Lake City is Great Salt Lake, that source of water vapor. So any of the proposals that are saying, let's re-engineer the lake so that it needs less water, for me is a non-starter, because we would literally change the climate. We've seen this at a large scale with the Aral Sea. When the Aral Sea collapsed, there was widespread desertification, decreases in snowpack. The crops that they were trying to grow with the diverted lake water could no longer be grown in many of those regions because it got too dry, too hot. The second reason is a third of the hemisphere's shorebirds depend on Great Salt Lake. Take that in for a second. A third of the shorebirds in North America depend on Great Salt Lake. A third reason, anybody know what these are? So I love that alfalfa field is what somebody thought, right? It's hard to tell. This is a picture I took out of the window of an airplane taking off from the Salt Lake Airport. These are evaporation ponds. So companies take water from the lake, evaporate it, they harvest the salts, and those salts go into all kinds of products that you may not know about. So it's the largest source of potassium of sulfate, a high-quality fertilizer that's used to grow stone fruits and other crops. It's the only source of magnesium in the country that's used in every kind of aluminum and titanium alloy. The brine shrimp from the lake are used to produce aquaculture around the world, tilapia and table shrimp. Altogether, this amounts to $2.5 billion a year of direct economic activity. And I want to just go to the last reason, which is why we're here, which is the dust. So on the left, we see a picture from the Aral Sea where there was complete economic collapse and whole communities that were moved. On the right side, however, is Mar Chiquita. Now, Great Salt Lake used to be the largest saline lake in the Western Hemisphere. It no longer is. Mar Chiquita in Argentina is now larger than Great Salt Lake, which is why I think we could tap into the Make Salt Lake Great Again theme, right? Like, this is unacceptable that South America is in the lead, people. Well, what's going on the right side? This is a 400-kilometer-long plume of dust. And that salty dust is being deposited on the agricultural fields, and it's already begun to reduce soil fertility and damage those crops. That's the same story that's starting to happen here. Here's a picture from Owens Lake, water diverted for LA County. The lake, even though it's between 5 and 8% the size of Great Salt Lake, became the largest source of particulate matter pollution in the country. They've spent billions of dollars just on the dust abatement. Here's a picture of dust coming off of the Salton Sea, California's largest lake, also a terminal lake like Great Salt Lake. Another close-up picture where you can see that dust moving over the agricultural fields. One of the things the dust does is, this is what our snowpack is supposed to look like. Increasingly, it looks like this. Maybe you can't see it very well. The dust is dark, it absorbs more energy, and in 2022, the most recent date for which we have good data, snowmelt happened 17 days earlier than it would have because of that dust, not only from Great Salt Lake, but also Severe Dry Lake and a few other sources. But that is happening earlier and earlier. So imagine if you are a farmer and the river goes dry 17 days before it would have otherwise. That's the difference between getting your potatoes out of the ground or not. Imagine if you're a city trying to provide drinking water for the people, and several weeks earlier you don't have those supplies. Right? This is a really big deal for water supply. But this is the image that really haunts me. It's a picture from Uzbekistan, downwind of the Aral Sea. And what's going on in this picture? The dust is moving into an occupied area, right? And we have Dr. Dust himself here who will give us the details, but more and more this is what's happening off of Great Salt Lake. Now we notice it, we here in the Salt Lake Valley, when the winds are blowing in this direction. More often than not, the winds are actually blowing to the north. So a lot of the exposure is in communities that aren't connecting the haze and those impacts with the lake. That's part of our challenge. And I really believe one of the most impactful things we can do is starting to talk about why the lake matters and talk about where it is. There's nothing more terrifying than a table. So this is a table from a recent study from Iran, where Lake Urmia has been completely destroyed. It's as close as we have to a sister lake to Great Salt Lake in size, elevation, sedimentology. This is a study looking at what health conditions arose in the downwind communities. They identified 41 different conditions, including 6 kinds of cancer, birth defects, neurodegenerative disease, respiratory and cardiovascular disease. When we pollute our home, we pollute our bodies. Right? It's one of the lessons of ecology this century. There's no separation between environment and society. We live in the environment. It's our home. And the difference here is, even for the Aral Sea, we were only talking about hundreds of thousands of people. I say that not flippantly. Right? That's a huge deal. 500,000 people were permanently relocated. Here we have 3 to 5 million people downwind of the lake. Nothing like this has happened anywhere in the world. If you look at the infrastructure, the value of our roads and buildings, again, this is not a comprehensive assessment of why this matters, but let's just look at the infrastructure. Right? We're talking about around $1 trillion of infrastructure that's threatened. If property values decrease by a small amount, which we have evidence they already have been impacted, right? 17% of Utahns in recent polling said that they were considering leaving the area because of the decline of Great Salt Lake. Right? This is already impacting our lives. And the world is watching, right? More and more in the national news. Just a few days ago, did anybody see the article in The Nation? Great Salt Lake is a ticking time bomb. And this isn't just radical environmentalists like me that are saying this, right? Joel Ferry, the former lawmaker and current head of the Department of Natural Resources, called it an environmental nuclear bomb. So how much more water does the lake need? This is a big question. If you look at periods of time when the lake level was going up, periods of time that it was going down, it needs about 1 million acre-feet of more water. And that's hard to visualize, but imagine a football field covered in water with a column that goes up 190 miles. So up to the International Space Station. That's how much more water we need each year to flow to the lake to get it to come up. That translates into 1/3 to 1/2 decline in the amount of water we're consuming. 1/3 to 1/2. So this is not about low flush toilets, which, by the way, are one of the most reliable sources of water to the lake. Marianne Karin, of course, has written, "Flush once for yourself and once for the lake," which is a backwards way to run this, right? That's not how we want to solve this problem. But it demonstrates how convoluted the system is currently. 1/3 to 1/2 less water on our lawns, on our fields. When I share that information, this is often the look that I get. Like, wait, either you can't be serious or we have no chance. Right? Like, how could we do that? Well, I live in Utah Valley, My conservancy district is Central Utah Water Conservancy District. The acronym is CUCWD. Isn't that CUCWD? There. They're good at managing water, not at branding, right? Well, they set a goal, a conservation goal, for 15% water savings. Guess what? They hit that goal 30 years early and under budget. So this is imminently, yeah, let's give them a hand. Central Utah. Go CUCWD. Is anybody from Central Utah here today? Used to work there. Nice. You guys, we can do it. If you start looking at the augmentation proposals, a pipeline from the Pacific, that's going to take 30 years to get started. Right? And we're looking at a few or a couple hot, dry summers from the salinity getting so high that the food web collapses. Right? And this is actually one of the things I've heard especially up on Capitol Hill. Wait, isn't it risky to put all of our eggs in the conservation basket? And I think that's a little kooky. On the other hand, I want to give it to them. Let's look at these other options, right? Let's consider everything that's possible. But what we have today, in fact, the only thing that we have today that could increase water flow to the lake to make sure when a third of the shorebirds from North America show up that there's food there, is water conservation and then expressing our desires to the legislature to get that water to the lake. And this number of 1 million acre-feet is not some wacko number. The strike team, which is the preeminent group doing research on the lake, have found the same thing. Right? If we only save 770,000 acre-feet a year, that only gives us a 46% chance of ever reaching a healthy level. Right? So it has to be above that. Now, here's the kind of what I want to maybe not end on, but I want to point out. This is a trace of where the lake is going up till today. So we just crossed today 4192 feet. So we're back in the serious adverse conditions range. And by the way, these lines here don't consider the dust. The Great Salt Lake Matrix doesn't consider the public health and other risks from dust, just because that science wasn't as well established at the time it was developed. So we're in the deep red. And so far, everything that we've done has only resulted in 2% of the water that we need to restore the lake getting to the lake. Now, there's an additional amount that has been protected. So that's water that was already flowing to the lake, which is now not going to be developed. That's a huge step forward. And I don't share this number as an indictment. That 2% is hard won. And one of the things that I want to challenge all of us to do is to say, who can we give credit to? Right? And do any of you have children? Did any of you used to be children? So when you get scolded, that can change behavior. But what really changes your disposition is when you are rewarded, when you see how good it feels to get your chores done. My son Henry mowed the front and back lawn, and we have one of these old push mowers, just because I love suffering. And he's learned if he does that early, then he doesn't have to get all sweaty, right? That reward actually is more influential than us criticizing. So who can we reach out to thank? Who in the legislature? Who at our conservancy district? Who can we identify? Because this 2% did not happen on its own. It's only been a few years that it's even been legal to let water flow to the lake. Right? This is a major, major change. We have come, in the words of Steve Clyde, one of the premier water attorneys in the state, we have come light years in a very short period of time. Now, there are still light years to go, but we're only going to be able to complete this journey if we can share the credit and if we can both express our concern and also our commitment to be part of the solution. And so when I start to feel really discouraged about that 2%, because of my personal faith, I think about this scripture. And whatever your persuasion is, I'd ask you to consider the principles here, because I think this is powerful. God hath not given us the spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. So we need to understand. Faith alone doesn't do it. Now I believe that this big uptick was a response to prayer. That's my personal belief. right? The people of Utah from all different denominations came together. We asked for divine help. We got it. We got 200% of our normal precipitation in 2023, the largest snow year on record. And that gives us a shot at pulling off something that's never been done before. So faith lets us believe that we can do something that's never been done before. What else do we need? An understanding of how to get it done. And we need the power to implement that plan. And so that's what we're trying to create here together. And I'm so grateful for you being here. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Perry.
Who doesn't love Ben? He's so enthusiastic. I love your perspectives. It always challenges me to try and be optimistic when sometimes I get really pessimistic. But I'm here to talk about the dust, which is the scary thing that everybody seems to worry about. The reason why people call me up and said, do I need to leave Utah because of the dust? And hopefully I'll dispel some myths about the dust and give you some firm grounding so that you have a better understanding of what we know and, more importantly, what we don't know about the dust and what we need to do to be able to push our legislators to try and protect all the people, the 3 to 5 million people that live downwind from Great Salt Lake. This picture that we have right up here behind is very similar to the pictures that Ben was showing from the Aral Sea and from Marchiquita and some of the other saline lakes around the world. But this one is on our own backyard. This is a dust storm coming in from Great Salt Lake into Salt Lake Valley. And it's pretty dramatic when you see one of these. Many people don't realize it when we have these dust events. And so I'm going to help you figure out how to recognize a dust event so that you can protect yourself and tell you how to protect yourself along the way. So the government always talks about dust, and I have to give a little bit of terminology so that we can all be on the same page. Back in the 1970s, when they were trying to better understand the impact that particles had on people's respiratory system, they just measured all the particles in the air. That was the total suspended particulate, TSP. And the researchers were saying, well, the TSP doesn't really correspond very well with human health. And so they thought, well, a lot of those particles aren't even making it into your lungs. So let's look at particles that are smaller. And so they started looking at PM10 particles, particles that have a diameter less than 10 micrometers. And about 50% of these particles deposit in your nose and your throat, and about 50% end up in your lungs. And they did research and found that, oh, there is a relationship between these particles and human health. But they said, well, only half of those particles are making it into the lung. What if we just focus in on the smaller particles, the PM2.5? The ones that almost all make it into the lungs. And that's where they found really high concentrations of really high correlations between particles and human health. So the smaller the particle, the more likely they are to go deeper into your lung. And when it comes to dust, we have, in the dust community, we call ourselves dusties. We have dust storms and we have dust events. The dust storm will actually reduce the visibility to less than a quarter mile. Think about that. You can't see across your neighborhood. You certainly can't see the mountains. A dust event can have visibilities up to 7 miles. And these are kind of standard terminology that we use in the dust community. And all dust storms are dust events, but not all dust events are dust storms. So when I think about what's most frequent from Great Salt Lake, the dust events are much more frequent than the dust storms. That picture that I showed at the beginning was a dust storm. But dust events are much more frequent. And I'm going to give you some examples of dust storms, dust events on our own. So here is a webcam looking at downtown. Great Salt Lake is off to the right. And we had dust come in from Great Salt Lake and enter into the city and reduce the visibility to less than a quarter mile. And this would be a dust storm. We get two kinds of dust storms. We get the dry kind, we get the wet kind. The dry kind, you can see. The wet kind, it rains mud. I'd never seen it rain mud until I moved to Utah. And after one of these events, you can see the next day all the cars are lined up at the car wash. So here's an example looking out over Farmington Bay of a dust event. We still have dust coming off, but you can still see Antelope Island off in the distance. These are very common. These were going on out in the Great Salt Lake today. I was out there earlier today in one of these events. Not very pleasant. But here's an example, hopefully. Let's see if this will play. Well, all right, it's a video. Videos are always tough, sort of thing. It was an example. Yeah. No, it's just.
You don't need to be on the Wi-Fi.
No. Okay. That's good. Anyway, if you're in a dust event or dust storm, you feel like you're getting sandblasted. You've got all of these things that are moving around, hitting your legs, and then you've obviously got the stuff that you're breathing. I was out there today, and my throat hurts a little bit from being out there and that. So what do we know about the impacts of these particles? And there's been a lot of science about the relationship between exposure to PM10 and PM2.5 in human health. And the Environmental Protection Agency looked at all the science that was out there and came up with their best estimate for what would be considered healthy versus unhealthy concentrations. And it doesn't matter what the dust is made out of. If the concentrations are high enough, they're going to be unhealthy, and they're going to trigger a whole bunch of responses. Ben outlined a lot of those, but here's some more examples of that. Decreased lung function, aggravated asthma, bronchitis, irregular heartbeat, heart attack, stroke. All of these sorts of things are possible when you're exposed to these high concentrations of particles. And it's the responsibility in the state of Utah for the Division of Air Quality to actually monitor this to see if we are in a healthy range. But the other thing to think about is that according to the EPA, the PM10 concentrations of 149 are healthy and 150 is unhealthy. Now, nobody responds like that. There are some people that are going to be impacted at much lower concentrations, the most vulnerable, the children, the elderly, the people with asthma, the people with COPD. They will be impacted at much, much lower concentrations than is the federal standard. So I'm here to talk about dust and dust hotspots out on the Great Salt Lake. If we look at what controls the emission of dust from out there, we've got soil moisture. We typically don't get dust events in the wintertime. Why? Because it's wet out there. If you ever try and go out and walk along the Great Salt Lake in the wintertime, it's muddy. That doesn't mean that we can't have a dry winter and we can't have dust events. I've seen dust coming off the Great Salt Lake in every month of the year now. This year, we had a big dust event that happened in January because we had a dry January. The other thing about Great Salt Lake, which is really in our favor, is that there's a surface crust out on much of Great Salt Lake. It's a naturally occurring crust. Some places it's salt, some places it's clay, mud crust. And when we have an intact crust, that prevents dust from getting lofted from the surface. So crust is our friend. Vegetation is our friend. There are parts of the lake bed that are revegetating, and the vegetation tends to slow the wind speed down, and the root structure helps collect those particles and lock them in place. There's also particle size. Great Salt Lake is an ancient lake, and a lot of the material out there is sand. If you go to the beach and you grab a handful of sand and you throw it up in the air, what's going to happen? Well, you're going to get kicked off the beach for one thing, but it's basically just going to come right back down. They're big particles. You go to a farmer's field and you grab a handful of soil and you throw it up in the air. The big clods will come back down, but there's going to be a cloud of dust that wafts away. Those are the small particles. And those small particles are delivered to the lake from the rivers. The Jordan River, the Weber River, and the Bear River, which all feed into the eastern side of the lake. So where do we have those small particles that are most likely to get lofted and end up in our lungs? In the eastern side of the lake. Farmington Bay, Ogden Bay, Bear River Bay, right close to those 3 million people that live along the shores of Great Salt Lake. So where are these dust hotspots located? So I went out and spent 2 years on my fat tire bike on a journey around Great Salt Lake, collecting soil samples every 500 meters, bicycled like 2,700 miles to do it, to find out where the dust hotspots were actually located. And there are basically 4 areas: Farmington Bay in the southeast, Bear River Bay in the northeast, way up far away from everybody in the extreme northwest, up in Gunnison Bay, and then over near U.S. Magnesium on the west side. And these dust hotspots are not equally distributed over the entire lake. There are preferential areas where you end up with dust coming off. And Farmington Bay is a pretty good source of dust over a lot of the eastern part. And put it into perspective, square miles. How many square miles of dust hotspots do we have out on the lake? Well, in Farmington Bay, that's the biggest area of dust hotspots, the one that's closest to us. It's more than 21 square miles of dust hotspots. And then we have Gilbert Bay at 19 square miles, Gunnison Bay at 16, and Bear River Bay at 13. You add that all together, and that's 70 square miles of lake bed. That's about 9% of the total lake bed. That is what it was in 2018 when I finished my survey. Unfortunately, what's happened over the last 7 years? It's remained dry, it's remained low lake levels, and there's actually more than 9% of the lake bed. When you start looking at the surface crust and the particles, the maximum amount of the lake bed that could probably serve as a dust hotspot would be about 24%, which is massive. So you would basically more than double that 70 square miles to 150 or 170 square miles. And we know what elevation these dust hotspots are located. So Ben alluded to this and said that the ecological health of the lake, the minimum that was established in the matrix of 4,198 feet. At 4,198 feet, if we were to bring the lake up to that level, on this plot it basically shows that you would end up covering up only about a third of all the dust hotspots. This is a problem. Basically what it says is that when the lake started getting lower and lower and lower, one of the first problems that came out of this was dust. It's one of the first problems to emerge, and it'll be one of the last problems to be solved if you're just trying to solve it by putting water in the lake. In fact, if you want to cover up 80% of the dust hotspots on Great Salt Lake, you have to go all the way up to 4,203, which is 11 feet higher than what we are today, or 11 and a half feet higher than what we are today. It's a massive amount of water. So when do we get these dust events? Primarily not in the winter, because it's too wet, and we have really strong winds in the spring and the fall. And we also get thunderstorms sometimes in the summer, not so much this year. It's been a very hot, dry summer. But the spring and the fall are when we have these cold fronts that come through, really strong winds from the south, and then followed by strong winds from the north. And they can be wet or dry. Don't really want to say anything about this other than the composition of the dust out there is different than soil. It's salty, as you can expect. And it is enriched in some of the minerals associated with salts. That's why they mine it, because it has all of these salts in it, sort of thing. But there are other things in it. So I've measured the metal concentrations in the soil around the Great Salt Lake, but there are also other things out there. It's a terminal basin lake. everything that goes into the rivers ends up in the lake and eventually ends up in the sediment out there. The history of pollution in northern Utah, the mining, the industry, what we're doing to our yards with fertilizers. The lake is the repository for all of that material. And we know that there are organic contaminants, PCBs, pesticides that end up in the lake. There was a recent paper that came out with cyanotoxins, which are in the algae that can cause problems. And then, of course, the metals that are out there as well. And the metals is what I'm an expert on, so that's what I'm going to talk about. And you've probably heard this, and this is one of the reasons Joel Ferry was talking about the ecological problems associated with the lake, is that every measurement that I took of arsenic out on Great Salt Lake was more than a factor of 10 higher than what would be recommended for routine exposure from the Environmental Protection Agency. And this arsenic is distributed over the entire lake bed, which tells me that a lot of this is naturally occurring arsenic. If I go to lake beds in Nevada, they also have arsenic. If I go to lake beds in California, they also have arsenic. We also have a mining legacy here, where we have arsenic that has come in and augmented that. We have higher arsenic concentrations in our lake bed than other lake beds around. And it's a carcinogen. It causes cancer. And can cause lung cancer, skin cancer, bladder cancer, etc. But arsenic wasn't the only metal that caused concern, or as a contaminant of concern. We've got lanthanum and lithium and zirconium and cobalt and manganese and copper. These are ones that, some of these are evenly distributed around the lake, which kind of look towards naturally occurring elements like lanthanum. And then you have ones that have hot spots, like lithium and zirconium and copper. Those are all associated with industrial pollutants or ammunition, that sort of thing. And then we have aluminum and iron and antimony, thallium, vanadium, and uranium are all other elements out there that are higher than what the EPA would recommend for routine exposure. And then we did some research to find out, well, what fraction of these metals are bioavailable, can be absorbed by your body? Because if they're all locked up in minerals that don't interact with your body, then it really doesn't matter. Unfortunately, the work that we found is over on the right. The tan-colored things are the metal bioavailability of Great Salt Lake dust versus the purple, which are other playas, other dried lake beds in the region. So we have more metals that are available to get into your body, which makes the dust that much more dangerous. But where does it go? So we've got these 4 dust hotspot areas. Well, when we have these cold fronts come, we'll get the really strong winds from the south for 12 to 18 hours. That's going to push this dust north, up into Logan, Brigham City, Idaho. And then that cold front will come through and the winds will reverse and come down to the south. And that'll push it into Tooele and Salt Lake County and Utah County, down where Ben lives. And it doesn't take very long to get there, because these dust events are happening when the winds are 25 miles an hour or more, typically. And it only takes an hour for that dust to reach Park City and the Utah County line. Within 2 hours, it can be down in Provo. 3 hours can be even further than that, less than 3 hours to Logan. And those particles don't fall out in that time frame. They are making it that far. They're just getting diluted a little bit. So the question is what do we know about where this dust is moving? Now, Ben said that we know that a lot of this dust moves north, away from Great Salt Lake. How do we know that? Well, we looked at the winds at the airport for the last 10 years. And when we have strong winds, 25-mile-an-hour winds, they tend to be from the south. In fact, 75% of the time, those strong winds are from the south, pushing that dust north into Layton and Syracuse and Kaysville and up towards Ogden, where we don't have any monitors. Oh, that's convenient. Where we do have our monitors is down in Salt Lake County, and 25% of the time, that's when the wind is pushing that dust into Salt Lake County. And we've done some modeling results and have identified that the people living closest to the lake are the ones that are most vulnerable. Oh man, that's rocket science, you know? It's true, but it's not just the people in Salt Lake County, it's also the people north of the lake. And that's one of the revelations from this recent project that we discovered along the way. But you don't just breathe dust. There's other ways that it can get into your body. You've got your direct exposure where you do breathe it, but that dust can end up on your garden and your crops. And if it's not properly cleaned, you can ingest it. A lot of this dust will end up, in and around your home and can get ingested unintentionally. And there was a recent study done by Molly Blakowski up at Utah State University that said, well, are the plants that we're growing, are they taking up any of these metals? Are they capable of taking up metals from the dust? And she discovered, using cabbage leaves, that they were actually very effective at accumulating arsenic and uranium in the leaves of the plant crops that have been exposed to Great Salt Lake dust. So we have multiple ways that we can be exposed to the dust. And then Ben already said this, he stole my thunder. He's always doing that. But if there's been modeling that was done up at the University of Utah by Mackenzie Skiles in the geography department, looking at the rate at which the snowpack melts. And the green line here is from 2022, what the predicted melt rate for the snowpack would have been, and the tan line is what actually happened. And the reason why the snow melted 2.5 weeks early was because of the dust on the snow. I talked to the people up at Snowbird, and they had that 200% of normal snowpack. They say, we're going to be skiing until August. They were done by the end of May because of the rate of the melt. And Ben did a much better job than this, than I am. But if we look at the U.S. economic impacts of dust from all different sources, tropical cyclones, hurricanes, number 1. Number 2, windblown dust, followed by wildfires. If you go out to the regular, do a poll of the people, they're thinking, wildfires, we're so concerned about wildfires and the economic costs associated with that. Well, dust is even more costly than that. But what don't we know about Great Salt Lake dust? We don't know how frequent they are. We don't know what those concentrations are in the vulnerable communities. We don't know the concentrations of the metals. We don't know if we're violating the national ambient air quality standards. And we don't know the healthcare costs associated with this. And I have to ask why. Why? Because the state of Utah has failed to put in a monitoring network that can actually answer these questions, despite the clear need and the examples of all of the health impacts that have had at other saline lakes. Ben said this very eloquently, that we've seen this written before. It's not a secret about the health impacts of this. I have no doubt that people are being impacted this right now, but the state won't be forced to do anything about it until they actually have data. The governor put in a request for $650,000 last year for a best monitoring network. The legislature appealed that back to $150,000, which is enough to hire one person to study dust and $0 for equipment for that person to actually have data to look at. And so we're still in this limbo land of the people want to know the answer. I want to know the answer. I don't want 5 years from now just not knowing the answer of what the actual impacts are in the vulnerable communities, and we have a right to demand that from our state. And they're dragging their heels on that, and all the pressure that we can put on them would be greatly appreciated. And I will end on that note, but just to say that I am optimistic about Great Salt Lake. I've scared a lot of people with the dust. You don't need to move away from Utah. You can protect yourself from the dust if you know that it's coming. You can put on your N95 mask. It does a really good job of protecting from those big particles. Not so good for wildfire smoke. Those particles are smaller and they can go through the fabric and get to your lungs. You can stay inside, but you have to have an alert to let you know. And where do you get an alert? From a monitoring network, which we don't have. So people are being unnecessarily put at risk because we don't have the monitoring in place to actually do that. So should we move away from Utah because of dust? No. It's a wonderful place to live. There are things that you can do to protect yourself, but more importantly, by saving the lake and putting water back in the lake, we can reduce the dust. I moved here 25 years ago, and dust wasn't a problem. And I hope to be in Utah another 25 years, and I hope that once again dust won't be a problem. And I'm optimistic because this is a local problem. It's not being driven by climate change, it's not being driven by drought, it's being driven by values. And we can change the way we value water. We can conserve 30%, 50%. 30% just gets us to the lake not shrinking. We have to be more aggressive to actually restore the lake to its vibrant ecosystem that it once was, and will hopefully continue to be for our children. So thank you very much.
Okay, everyone. So now we're going to open it up to Q&A. So if anyone has questions ready to go that they know they'd love to ask, I'm just going to ask you to come up to the microphone here. And you guys can tag team, the answers. Great. And then we'll just have a queue going, anyone who wants to ask. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Got a dusty question for you. How long does a patch of playa need to be dry before we lose the crust and we start getting significant dust? And based on that, how often do we want to be at like 4,205 feet to get 90% mitigation?
So I'm doing that experiment right now out on the lakebed. And the beauty of it is that it's relatively easy to reset the crust. You can reset the crust with as little as a half an inch of water. The question is, how long does that last? And that's the experiment that I'm doing this summer. A quarter inch of water only reset the crust for about a month. Half an inch seems to be a little bit longer, but it's not something that will solve it for an entire season. So the dust hotspots recur in the same places every single year because those are the places where the groundwater doesn't replenish. And so the location of the hotspots is very closely tied to where the groundwater is not making it to the surface. And so you'll see it year after year in the same spots. But every winter, the entire lake bed is reset because it's wet. And then it dries out. And depending on meteorology, we can get dust storms in spring. Sometimes it's too wet in the spring and we don't get them till the summer or the fall.
Hello. I'm curious because I've heard some conversations in Division of Forestry, Fire and State Lands and others about changing the flood control system in the lower Jordan River because it currently actually physically prevents more than a certain amount of water from entering Great Salt Lake through normal channels. And I'm curious, out of those 21 miles of exposed lake bed, how much of a difference would that realistically make?
Yeah, so a lot of the water coming through the Jordan River is diverted through the Goggin Drain, so it goes into Gilbert Bay directly. And there are co-benefits to restoring more of that to its natural flow rate. I don't know the numbers, maybe Kevin does, about specifically how much of the lake bed is exposed or would be covered by that, but that's mainly a matter of the lake elevation, not the inflow to the lake.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Forestry, Fire, and State Lands is commissioning a study right now to try and figure out, what you could do with the Jordan River water in Farmington Bay through some mitigation techniques. But I just want to stress that, cutting off Farmington Bay and impounding the water there is a very dangerous technique. I think you can say it best if you wanted to describe what you were using it to do that.
Sure. We were talking about this exact proposal earlier, which has been around since the 1920s. So if you go back to the 1920s, you can find the reporter Caroline Tracy, who used to be with High Country News, showed this. There was a proposal to basically cut Great Salt Lake in half vertically and then have a freshwater impoundment near the communities. It would have made for great water skiing. Right, that was part of the reasoning at the time. They also wanted to, by the way, build Tailings Island with all of the tailings from Kennecott and put those out in the lake, right? Well, this idea is resurgent again. Instead of conserving water, let's re-engineer the lake so that it doesn't need this. And it's the equivalent of trying to, if you were in trauma and on life support, giving yourself a blood transfusion, right? So it does not solve the problem. You're taking water from one bay and putting it in another. We need to be thinking about a holistic solution. Right now, already the habitat in Farmington Bay has been destroyed if you're looking at what it used to be. So it's no longer saline lake habitat. And in fact, the invertebrates, the microbial community are all different. So we're only left with Gilbert Bay. I really think we need to take a lake-first approach where we're asking, how much does the lake need? And then letting that inform our behavior, saying, okay, how much can we use? And we are incredibly innovative. We're good with technology, we're good with behavioral change, but only after we set that budget.
Yes, I asked this question of Representative Doug Owens, who was intrigued kind of by the possibility of it. For those who don't know, a severance tax is a tax levied by a government entity on natural resources that are shipped beyond the entity. So these are done, I mean, Alaska does it with its oil, everybody does it with natural resources. What's the possibility of having a severance tax on exported alfalfa? Farmers can grow as much as they want for the livestock they have or have contracts with within the Great Salt Lake Basin. But for any alfalfa shipped out of the area, there would be a huge tax, and you could have offsets if they convert their land to lower water crops or turn it into fallow, putting solar farms on it. What are the possibilities of working with legislators on that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And we need again to put all of these options out on the table and say, what's the cost of implementing it? What are the legal barriers? How much political support is there for that? As an example of one of the potential negative consequences of that approach, 2/3 of the livestock feed that's consumed in the watershed is already imported. So this isn't a story of us growing alfalfa to support local dairies and meat, right? We're already importing most of that feed, and we're exporting quite a bit. So if you were to say, all right, let's draw a line around the watershed and not let it export, that could backfire if, in return, we couldn't import it, right, to meet those needs. We could end up stimulating the approach. But we need a holistic solution. So far, there has been really interesting individual proposals made. Often, the dots aren't all connected, and so we don't see how it's going to impact the whole system. And we're only going to create the political operating space to think about that comprehensive lake rescue solution if we get engaged. And I just want to give ourselves an indictment. And when I was listening to Kevin, I was like, that Ben Abbott guy is just way too optimistic. Especially about, right? It is shameful that we do not have a monitoring network to know whose lives are being harmed.
Yeah.
Right? This is unacceptable. It's unacceptable. And now I've totally forgotten what I was going to say. Sorry, you got me. Yeah, finish me off.
I just want to say that we could turn off the water to every single home in northern Utah and every single industry in northern Utah. And if agriculture doesn't change, the lake will still shrink. We cannot get there without partnering with agriculture to find new ways to think outside the box, to do things differently. Because we can't do this in isolation without the farming community, because that's where the water use is happening.
On the other hand, Kevin, as long as we are in a position of somebody else needs to fix this, we're not going to do it.
Yep.
And that cities are, between 10 and 25% of the problem. That's important, right? And we were talking with some urban irrigation and sprinkler companies the other day. It's estimated that we overwater in our lawns by a factor of 2. That means we could achieve a 50% water conservation in cities with no change in landscaping at all, just by installing smart controllers and irrigating the right amount, right? So we don't want to poo-poo it, and I think it's, the farmers are saying, at least what we're growing has a value, right, besides just decoration. So until there's not another blade of Kentucky bluegrass in the watershed, we're not going to move forward. We all need to look at what can we do.
Thank you both for these excellent presentations. And for your lake-facing leadership, we're so lucky to have you. I want to ask about, speaking of who's being harmed, I saw a slide in Molly Bukowski's thesis presentation that haunts me, and it was showing the relative impact on children because of the smaller size of their bodies. And Kevin, I wonder if you have something to say about that, and if both of you might. What I'm curious is, why isn't that in the news? Like, why isn't that a headline? You know, the relative impact on children in a place that cares so much about children. So.
Yeah, absolutely. We know that people are impacted differently based upon body size, respiration rate, and children in particular, because of their small size and fast respiration, are particularly vulnerable. And we have a duty in our society to protect the most vulnerable people, and instead of just going for the bare bones of we're not violating the national ambient air quality standards, therefore we don't need to do anything, is very short-sighted and goes against our fundamental principles of trying to protect the most vulnerable.
And I think that there's an interesting double-edged sword here. Because if we simply say it is only the vulnerable that are impacted, that's technically true, but guess what? Anybody with lungs is vulnerable. Anybody with a heart or a brain or reproductive organs is vulnerable. We're all in this together. And so I don't know exactly what the message is that's going to appeal, and no single message is going to appeal to anyone, to everyone, right? So think about what resonates with you, amplify and share that message. And I remembered the thing that I was going to say. In 2022, when the lake nearly died, right, when half of the food web collapsed and the flies couldn't reproduce, we heard this from Tim Hawks, who was a representative at the time. He was the leader of the policy innovation. Guess how many emails he got about Great Salt Lake that year? 2. We have an incorrect belief that somebody else is going to do this. Right, that somebody else is going to write the email or make the phone call. They are not. Right? We are the group of people that have to start this change. And so we've got to, again, and it's going to be a mix. You don't have to know the solution. But all of us should go home today and figure, le.utah.gov. You can look up who your representative and senator are. Start developing that relationship. Reach out to somebody else. Washington County. Right? They have the same vote that Doug Owens does right here, right? We've got to do better, right? And so rather than pointing at the farmers, rather than saying, why isn't the legislature doing this? We live in the United States of America, and our leaders are followers, right? That's how the system is designed. They are supposed to follow our values, getting to what Kevin said. So let's manifest those values and do what we can.
So I organize some events and gatherings with my friends where we go out to the lake and we help people build relationships with this beautiful place, and often down in Black Rock and the South Shore, and we're interacting with the playa a lot, and we're starting to get questions about like, what is it? Like, I'm thinking about the dust, but I'm also thinking about the playa itself, and like, our questions about how we hold space safely and like invite people in with like informed risk is, I guess, like, what are the best practices for interacting with the playa, considering like not only the naturally occurring heavy metals, but also the like pollutants from extractive industry and what is flowed downstream.
Yeah, the best way to treat the playa is to avoid it. So any human activity out on the playa disturbs it and breaks down the crust. So that's why motorized vehicles are, one of the reasons motorized vehicles are prohibited on the lake without permit. So it's one of the reasons that I do all my research on bicycles, so that I don't damage the crust. So keeping people off the crust from recreation vehicles and other sorts of things is vital. But more importantly is that periodic re-wetting with the idea of hopefully submerging. So that's the best solution, because when I moved here 25 years ago, all of these dust hotspots that I'm talking about now were underwater. And I wasn't working on dust issues because it wasn't an issue. And like I said, hopefully in the future we'll get back to that situation.
So that 5-year number has kind of haunted me ever since I read it. And I'm curious, so best case scenario it sounds like is if we're able to convince people or mandate they use a third to a half, right? Is that what you said? What would need to be just to maintain?
A half would restore the lake.
Restore, okay.
Yeah,
Third
that's
to
right.
maintain,
And a third to
half
maintain.
to restore.
Yeah. And some estimates as low as 10% watershed-wide could stabilize the lake near where it is now,
Okay.
right? Which is, it's not all or nothing, right? The more we save, the safer we are.
So if that is to be able to, even if we hit 10% or some
Yeah.
conservative goal, is it still a matter of when, not if? Like, are we trying to buy time?
Yeah.
Because essentially that's what we're doing. And if so, do you have any data on like how much time do we think we can realistically buy given climate change as a whole and stuff like? I'm curious as to if you have a number or a range, like how much time are we trying to buy?
Yeah. So if you look at the climate change projections of temperature and precipitation through the end of the century, natural river runoff is going to go down, right? And the estimates aren't precise, but it's around 15%. So by the end of the century, we'll need to have an additional 15% less diversion and consumption. But we've got time to ramp up to that. What we don't have time for is to wait 30 years, right? If the current plan is within the next 30 years, let's get up to a healthy level. And Brad Wilson, does anybody know who Brad Wilson is, right? He's the former Speaker of the House. I'm sure that he's universally loved, right? He's only made good choices. I say that as a joke because all of us, right, are going to be loved by some and despised by others, right? And I think this is an issue where we can bridge. But he said something interesting the other day because he's on the Olympic committee. When's the Olympics happening? So he said it would be a dumb idea to save the lake because of the Olympics. But the Olympics could be helpful for us saving the lake, right? The reason why we're doing this isn't because there's going to be a sporting event. We don't want to look bad. No, but that could be something that unifies us. And that's what I think our timeline should be. Within the next 2 years, we have to commit to a plan. And we have to get real about how much it costs, right? If we go, the current tools that are being considered are all voluntary and compensated. So nobody is seriously talking about mandated cuts right now. Well, what we need to do is run the numbers and say, how much will that cost to get to a healthy level? The answer is, there now are multiple economic numbers, it's between $100 and $500 million a year to acquire enough water and get it to the lake. Now, that's a big number. Those are big numbers. They're not impossible numbers. But we need to have that level of specificity so we can say, okay, how much does it look like if there also are gradual mandated cuts through time? Not all at once. Like, let's start fully voluntary. But then that creates incentive for farmers and cities and others to get in and participate in these programs. Because right now, the water markets aren't working. And again, it's not a big surprise. This is a huge change. It takes time for the bugs to get worked out. But we got to get real, not asking the question, what's politically possible? But asking the question, what's needed to solve the problem? And then let's change the political reality to make that happen.
And I want to put those numbers into perspective. You said $150 million sounds like an incredible amount of money until you talk to people from California that are spending $150 million a year on dust mitigation for Owens Lake, which is, and plus $2.5 billion invested over the last 20 years to get to that stage. Yeah. So I'd rather spend $150 million saving the lake than $150 million forever doing dust mitigation.
That's right. We're talking about a small investment that will have huge payoffs. And so again, Some of us are going to respond more to that risk message. Some of us are going to respond more to the opportunity message. This could remake our community for the better, right? I really believe that this is the crisis we need right now.
This is in the political vein, sort of a softball question for Ben, but if you were interested in getting to know your legislators in more than an email and a phone call, which can often, for a lot of people, myself included, feel very like one-sided, like you're just like throwing a tomato at the wall and like hoping it sticks. If you're in or outside of the legislative session, how would you recommend engaging with legislators like in person?
Thanks for that question, Kale. And it's not a softball, actually, right? It's complicated how to connect. But our managing director at Grow the Flow is Jake Dreyfus. And he said, so he's been really leading a lot of the legislative outreach. And his observation is, during the session, you can't build bridges. You can only burn them, right? We've got to be thinking about this year long, right? It isn't just the 45 days that the legislature's up on Capitol Hill, right? It's right now. And again, the invitation is tomorrow or even tonight, send off that email. And, Grow the Flow is one of the groups. There are many others here that are working on this. And find the one or the ones that resonate with you and plug in, right? Because we've got to be coordinated. And there's a really positive example. A few people in the legislature tried to build another dam last year, right? The Bear River development that would have taken another 100,000 acre-feet to 150,000 acre-feet of water from the lake. We were able to get advanced knowledge of what was going on. We mobilized a relatively small group of people, just a couple thousand people, and then targeted the messaging at the right people, the conservancy districts and the leadership that was doing this. They backed off before it was ever announced, right? So a few people targeted and organized really can make a difference. Bill McKibben, the climate activist, when he says, what's the number one thing an individual can do for climate change? His answer is, don't act as an individual. Get organized, build a community, right? So the most valuable thing you can do tonight is go talk to these people, right, and get plugged in.
Thank you so much for everything you're doing and for the presentation. When I think about this issue, I think about it in several layers, but I found myself filled with some grief throughout the presentation because I see this as so much of a crisis of relationship and a crisis of intimacy with our more than human species in our home. Mm-hmm. And I know that the ecological crisis is a crisis of intimacy, a crisis of human connection and connection with all of life. So I know that there are entry points that are mechanical, where we're talking about the dust, where we're talking about some of these things that are imminent and cause fear to induce quick movement. And I'm really interested in the lasting spiritual change that is going to be required if we have a sustainable relationship with this world. Mm-hmm. What have you seen work or change or happen in that sphere? What has moved people? What do you see?
Start?
No, go ahead, Kevin.
When I moved to Utah 25 years ago, if you talk to people, what did they care about? Education was at the top of the list. What the future going to be for our children, sort of thing. And air quality was way down the list. Even though the air quality that we had, 30 years ago was much, much worse than it is now. But there was a group, the Utah Physicians for Healthy Environment, that went on a PR campaign to try and educate the people about the linkages between air quality and health. And that was done very effectively in a very short period of time. And so when people started seeing dust coming off the lake, they immediately went to that base knowledge that they had of, how is this going to affect myself? How is this going to affect my children? And so it's really educating the public. I was really pessimistic in 2019 when I started doing educational outreach, that I would go out and talk to groups like this, and only 15 or 20% of the people even knew that the lake was shrinking, and fewer than that even cared about it. And now, when I go out, it's the exact opposite. It's 80-85% of the people are well aware of the issues and care about it. If we could only get that same switch in the legislature, that would be really helpful as well.
Thank you for that question, and I really felt moved. And I completely agree that this is an issue of values and relationships with the lake, with other life, with one another. And I just want to point at two experts. Izzy, you raise your hand? And Liam, you raise your hand? These are two of the people that have changed the dialogue, right, and connected with young people. And they both have beautiful stories, but I'll tell one. Izzy called up Grow the Flow one day, and she said, "Could you buy us some chicken sandwiches?" And we were like, "Sure," because whenever anybody asks you to buy them a chicken sandwich, even if you're a vegetarian, you should do it. And so we bought her some chicken sandwiches. We thought there'd be a few students there, right? She's a high school student. She had invited the student body presidents from all of the high schools in the valley and gotten them together at the courthouse, and it's like. That's what one person can do, right? And it's going to look different for each of us, right? It's going to be a work of art. It's going to be a family member that you know, your old rich aunt that you haven't talked with for a long time because she's such a pain, right? Maybe this is the moment to reconnect and ask her to give some money to Great Salt Lake, right? Like, it's going to be different for each person, but I promise you that if you look inward and listen, that you'll be led to something that's impactful.
How are you? A lot of people are really skeptical about the lake. What would you say to them?
When you say skeptical, what do you mean, Grace?
Just not believing it, or
Yeah.
being very pessimistic about it.
Yeah.
And our solutions and what we're trying to do.
Yeah. So thank you for that question. And there's so many different ways to be skeptical. You can say, it's not really that big of an issue. Do you remember how the environmental scientists used to tell us that there's a hole in the ozone? I don't hear anybody talking about that anymore, right? Do you guys know why? Because we fixed the problem, right? We talked about it, and then we fixed it, right? But we're in a moment of extreme skepticism right now, right? Where people don't trust institutions. I thought, as a member of the predominant religion in this area, that when the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints made a very large donation to the Watershed Enhancement Trust, that would unlock the floodgates of donations. And it didn't, right? We haven't seen the progress that we wanted to. So the institutions, old and new, no longer have the influence that they once did. And so we've got to think, how can we connect with different people? But I think a part of the key is in the cabbage leaves. So do you remember the cabbage leaves? This is terrifying. Molly's research. The leaves become radioactive after the dust falls. When there was a project that wanted to build Utah's largest city in the middle of Utah Lake, in my backyard, people came together to speak out against this project for a bunch of different reasons. And we had the environmental advocates, and we had the people that hate the new woke Utah flag that were working together and signed this petition. And people care about the safety in their own backyards. They care about the health of their kids. Right? And I really think that this is an issue that can help us bridge some of those divides and tear down those walls. So yeah, figure out what resonates with you and talk to people. Talk to people.
What does this look like for the ski industry in the next 10 years if we keep going down this road? And what happens to the water supply if these ski resorts increasingly rely on man-made snow?
Mm-hmm.
So we know that as the lake shrinks, it produces less lake effect snow. The research shows that the lake itself is responsible for about 8% of the snow in the Wasatch, which doesn't sound like a lot, but that's the early season snow that jumpstarts the season. And as the lake shrinks, we get less of that early season snow, which puts more pressure to do the man-made snow, which then uses more of the water, which ends up evaporating to the atmosphere, sublimating from the snowpack, and it's this vicious cycle. The smaller the lake gets, the harder it is on the ski area, and we know that every inch of snow contributes more than $2 million to the local economy. We are fortunate that Utah, as the climate warms up and a lot of the low and mid-elevation ski resorts across the country struggle to operate, Utah will have the greatest snow on Earth and the last snow on Earth at our very high sites. So we've got that going for us forward, but you're right, it just gets much, much more difficult and affects the hydrology in a negative feedback cycle.
To the second part of that question with water supply, I had a conversation with a legislator whose name I won't mention, who acknowledged the risk, right, and said basically nobody's even talking about as we shift from a snow-dominated to a rain-dominated system, because it'll be so different. So there's a parallel here. Can we solve the collective governance, collective action problem of Great Salt Lake with a few million people? And can that be a model for how we address some of these bigger issues? And we're actually making amazing progress on climate change. And I say that as somebody who's been very depressed on that issue for a really long time. Almost all of the growth in energy is in wind and solar. And no presidential administration can change that, right? It's this economic and amazing shift that's happening. But I just wanted to say the ski industry already is being hammered in multiple ways, including having difficulty recruiting talent to come to the region. And so this gets back to the broader economic decline. One of the biggest developers in the state recently said you could solve the housing crisis really fast by letting the lake blow up, right? And right, the impacts are extreme. And so the ski industry already is having difficulty in some of those areas.
So I went to the most recent Great Salt Lake Advisory Council meeting where we discussed the numbers and the money that's available that has not been spent yet. So out of the 150 million obligated starting back in 2019, only 50 million has been spent through the agriculture water optimization program. So, encouraging farmers to do this seems more distant, and we can do that. But as of last week, there's $50 million available now for sort of any project that improves efficiency to the lake. And so I'm wondering how you would spend that, if you would put pressure on municipalities or, through all sorts of different things. And would you do that right up next to the lake, or would you do that more distantly? Does it matter, if the drain is clogged at the bottom, if you work more upstream, yeah. I guess, yeah.
Such a great question, and actually was discussing with several members across the many different state agencies involved in administering the lake rescue, and there's not consensus on what the highest and best next use of funds is. That's one of the things we've got to figure out, so we have a prioritized list. But for me, a few weeks ago, I was out at Mono Lake in California, another terminal lake, and the Conservancy District lead from Walker Lake, which is about as close as we have to a success story. This was a lake that was just absolutely plummeting. Harry Reid got a bunch of federal money to buy water from farmers, and they were able to stabilize and even partially restore the lake. Now, it still is well below its healthy level. But that's a lake where they're trying to get between 70 and 100,000 acre-feet of water. So how much compared to us? 7 to 10% of what we're trying to do. They have 238 water users in their watershed. Do you know how many large water rights holders we have? Over 100,000, right? They've got a staff of 6 full-time people working on getting that water, on administering the program to make sure there's enough water for the lake. We've got about that same number. And so what we know for sure is we need to scale up our teams, right? We need more people working on this. Outreach to farmers. Farmers are some of the most sophisticated thinkers in our community, right? They understand variability, probability, long-term planning. If we create a program that works for them, they will participate. The current system isn't working for them. Again, that's not an indictment. It's version 1. Of course it's probably gonna explode either on the launch pad or up in space, right? We've seen that. But we need to adapt. So rather than saying, we've spent a lot of money on this, great, we need to say, how much has the lake come up? That's the only KPI.
I was wondering more about the health risks with the dust storms, and specifically if pneumonia is a factor that happens from a consequence of them.
So there are lots and lots of different health issues associated with that. I don't know if that pneumonia was actually on that list of things that you said, was it?
I think it was.
It was? Yeah. So those are all based upon scientific research showing causation. So definitely a risk factor associated with that. So minimizing exposure. So the N95 masks do a good job. Being indoors during one of these events is certainly helpful. And the beauty of it is, I guess, in a sad sort of way, is that you can shelter inside during most of these events because they don't last for weeks like our wildfire season does. We've been inundated with wildfire smoke for weeks now. With the dust storms, they're quick hitters. They come in, they produce your dust when you're strong winds, and then winds die down, and it returns back to normal in terms of dust concentrations.
One of the things that we need is targeted public health research to come up with estimates of what's going on right here. So we collaborate with the Salton Sea Task Force, a smaller lake in Southern California that's dealing with this. This is a major focus of their work. Do you remember how many people live in the Salton Sea area?
Yeah, so at Owens Lake, it's 25,000 people. In the Salton Sea area, it's 250,000, and we've got more than 2.5 million.
Right. So we need to scale that up as well. And this is a real opportunity to link our research institutions, right, and look at those data. But since we don't have the rigorous data, I would love to know from you, how many of you have a condition that you believe is associated with exposure to Great Salt Lake dust? Yeah. These are real stories. And I think that part of our challenge is to go from that 3 to 5 million downwinder number to specific stories, right? And then let's also tell the success stories of farms and cities that are overachieving, right? The city of Sandy, they were looking forward at about a $40 million water infrastructure upgrade. Instead, they spent a couple $100,000 on conservation efforts and were able to offset the entire cost. Right? We should all know that story so that when, getting back to your question, was it you, Grace, about skepticism? We can say, well, wait, if Sandy can do it, certainly we can, because I mean, Sandy, right? Like, don't you think? Like, let's be familiar with the success stories so that somebody can't come and deflate our balloon. We can do this.
So I know that majority of the water that's supposed to be flowing into the lake is getting used for agriculture use. And so I was wondering if there's an option for farmers to use subsurface aquifers to help more flow go into the lake.
Yeah, the groundwater and surface water are connected. So if you pump the groundwater, that actually will reduce either the river flow or the lake level. And this is one of the lessons we learned from the West Desert. So as the salt flats started to decline, the belief at the time was that was a remnant from Lake Bonneville, the evaporite. That's not actually the case. It was being supported by groundwater. And agricultural wells and urban wells around that area had lowered the groundwater, so it was no longer reaching the surface. And when the state pumped water onto that in an attempt to have an engineering solution, it made it worse, right? It degraded those salt flats. We're in the same situation now. We can try to re-engineer the lake. There would be untold unintended consequences. Or we can say the lake, one of our ecological laws is nature knows best. Right? Let's be humble when we change these big systems. And let's move back as much as we can to the natural hydrology.
Yeah, I've got another similar story, and that has to do with Locomotive Springs up on the northern part of Great Salt Lake. I always thought that the name for Locomotive Springs happened because that's where the Transcontinental Railroad went through. But I was talking to some local people, and they said, no, there was 2 million gallons of water coming out of those springs, and it sounded like a train. And that's where it got its name from. And it supported this vast wetland up on the northern part of the lake with millions of birds. And the farmers started pumping the groundwater excessively. The springs dried up, and so did the wetlands. And now you go up there, and instead of this lush wetlands with millions of birds, you just have dry playa. So there are consequences to overutilizing that resource.
With the large amount of water that's being used for agriculture, where is the discussion in changing what we're growing on that land? Changing from irrigating through sprinklers to drip irrigation, and just changing the crops that we're growing here in Utah.
Good start.
Yeah.
So farmers grow alfalfa because it's a very important cash crop for them. The climate here is such that they grow very high quality alfalfa that is in demand worldwide, and that's why some of it's shipped to China and Saudi Arabia. We need to, whatever we do, we need to make the farmers whole so that they don't end up, crashing the local economy of rural areas. That's where the agricultural optimization or infrastructure optimization is from the state is trying to help by providing money to the farmers so that they can change how they irrigate their crops. And the idea is that if a project costs $100,000, then the state will put up 50% or $50,000, and the farmer will have to invest $50,000 to go along with it. And it's my understanding that we have more farmers that are willing to participate than we have money available. And the Great Salt Lake Strike Team did an analysis 2 years ago that basically said if we fully fund agricultural optimization, infrastructure optimization, until we run out of the farmers that are interested in participating, that we could reduce the agricultural water use by 15% without changing a single crop or without reducing yields. And that's just becoming more efficient at what you do. And then, that gets us part of the way there. That would be hard-fought ones. But we still have to go beyond that, which is where you have to start talking about how much land can we actually support. There is a transition that's going on that is a long-term trend of ag to municipal transformation. As the cities grow, farmers are selling their fields to those cities. And when you replace a farming area with a city, even if we do the horrible thing of planting Kentucky bluegrass, we still use less water. And so there is a long-term trend in that direction.
I just say there are questions about how much that shifting in irrigation techniques is saving. And some new data suggests that we're consuming about the same amount of water per acre, though we're diverting less from the rivers, so there still can be some benefit. Looking globally, the options are irrigate less land or switch to crops that consume less water. But again, I'm not blaming the farmers. They're responding to these market forces. But guess what? Utah's really good at changing market forces. And my dream scenario, I actually haven't ever said this in public, I think, but here we are. It's late, right? It's after 8 o'clock. What if we took the inland port money and used that to get the wheat infrastructure that we need? If you grow wheat, it uses 50% less water, and it has a higher per acre value. Right now, that's not an option for most farmers because we don't have the silos in the right places for them. That's the kind of infrastructure program or bottleneck that we could unstick really fast, and nobody's going to be upset. It only gives more options to the farmers. So sorry if anybody from the inland port's here. Or maybe you like the idea. Let's do it.
First of all, immense gratitude for all of the years that you've spent to know what you know, to be able to say today things that are true and things that are actionable. Second, today I held my latest granddaughter, three months old, on my lap, and I thought that if she lives as long as I do, she will be breathing this air for the next 90 years, if she lives that long. Third, Terry Tempest Williams says that the lake will be saved by love. And we've saved it as much by love as by water. I believe that's true. that if we truly love those people who are coming in the next generations, or our neighbors here, it means we will do something, however small, to try and do something to change this thing that affects all of us. I feel that being ancestors to those people is such a powerful idea, because it motivates me in my aging, dawdling years to do something to help others. So love and knowledge and faith in what we can do.
Amen.
Hi, I just wanted to name environmental racism, and speaking to the disproportionate effects of these crises on Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities, I want to ask the both of you, what are you doing to include these communities in your strategies, in your research, and how are you going to implicate them in the solutions and the all-around strategy of things that we're talking about today?
We absolutely know that environmental racism, environmental injustice is what I call it, is rampant. And we've done scientific research to actually show and demonstrate the disproportionate impact that dust from Great Salt Lake has on communities across Great Salt Lake watershed. And it's a story that needs to get more traction, not less, along those lines, because not everybody has the same impact of our choices that we make. But it also comes back to the fact that I'm a scientist and I look at things through a scientific lens, but asking for more data is not always the right answer, because this is really fundamentally not a scientific failure. It's a failure of values. And that's where we need to have our emphasis. I certainly want more data because it helps me make a stronger argument, but that's not what motivates change. It's working on those values, valuing everybody equally.
Thank you for that comment and question. And I'd add, what are the community networks already in place in those communities that we can empower to lead the change? And one example is the Episcopalian and Catholic churches are now coming together in an ecumenical group. And so many, for example, Hispanic immigrants participate in these faith communities. That's a network that's already there. And so how can we partner with and amplify those voices, I think, is really important.
Actually, I had the exact same question, but my question formed as you spoke. And I really appreciate, I cannot tell you how much I respect, mad respect for the work you do and everyone here. Sometimes it makes me cry. What I would like to add to your question is, for me, whatever it's worth, I'm a PhD economist. I have worked for many years and I left it because as much as I so much agree with what you are saying about solution through economic models, I have no hope anymore. I am so close to this gentleman here. So connecting to that question, it's not, for me, it's not about to include those communities for impact, but to bring them into knowledge sharing. For me, the most sophisticated knowledge comes from our tribal communities. As much as all our minds are colonized, there's something very, very, very core to this problem that your scripture, Timothy, I think I agree with this gentleman because solution is not an economic model solution. It's a solution that, so long story short, those communities, tribal communities, has incredible knowledge. And world is going through not an economic crisis, world is going through a spiritual crisis. So as a scientist, how can you connect with that original knowledge base? Not only impact, but bring people into this, bring and have conversations. You know, there are amazing conversations around science and spirituality these days, you know. You can split the weeds. Actually, I shouldn't offend weeds. Weeds are great. But you know what I mean? So, yeah, I will just wanna, that's my question, you know, what are you going to do next? Yeah. I'm going to connect with the legislature. Are you going to connect with indigenous knowledge holders in our valley? I want that from you.
Yeah. Thank you for that comment. And right now, there is no official representation on any committee that I know of the indigenous groups in this region. And that, again, it's like the monitoring network. It's something that's shameful and confusing. Right, we need all of those voices here. Beth Parker at the University of Utah is an environmental lawyer, and she is leading a group called the Great Salt Lake Project. And one of their initiatives is empowering tribal groups, many of whom have water rights that they're not benefiting from right now. So they've been taken often illegally in the recent past. Right, we're not talking about hundreds of years ago. We're talking about in the past 50 years. Some of these rights have been shifted illegally. And so the idea is help those indigenous groups recover their water rights, and then they are the ones who can decide if they want to lease or sell that water for Great Salt Lake, right? And then the benefit is flowing where it should be. So there are lots of opportunities, some of them legal and technical, some of them getting back to our roots. There is no principle more traditional and old school than living within our means. Right? We don't need to invent a new moral framework for this. We need to, in fact, reconnect with all of our ancestors and then be good ancestors, as Bob mentioned.
And to go back to the beginning, switch it around, demand less than supply. Yeah. Is really what it comes down to. And the indigenous communities have been living that way for millennia. I was really impressed by Darren Perry from the Shoshone tribe at the Stegner symposium that we had a few years ago up at the University of Utah. And he said it very eloquently that it only took 150 years to get into this state by not listening to the communities that had lived here for thousands of years.
I'll just keep this so brief because I know we had to wrap up. So I know a lot of us say, get organized. What does that mean? Because there's plenty of legislative action and heel hat off. There's also plenty of relationship building, but I want everybody to know that it's easy to mobilize against something. It's a lot harder to organize for something. So that also relies on your ability to think beyond governance, although that is a very strong component to this, and that's something that we all have to engage in. But it also includes shifting where you put your wealth, shifting who you seek information from and who you support and where a lot of our money goes, where a lot of our action goes. So what does organizing mean for you two?
It's such a good question, and not one that we can, of course, encapsulate all at once. But I do think, for example, one option, something that I was pushing for initially is we need a comprehensive lake rescue plan right now. Who's willing to move that bill forward? Well, the answer was Democrats, right? What happens when a Democrat brings forward a big, bold bill in Utah to the legislature? It's dead on arrival. And so actually it can be counterproductive to take that short-term view and say, okay, I'm going to find somebody who resonates with my values. And I'm not speaking personally, but wherever we are, right? I'm sure that we have a diversity of political opinions here. We need to be thinking strategically. And so for me, getting organized, I love what you say. Let's make sure that we're listening to the right people, also speaking to the right people. And that's what we're trying to do at Grow the Flow. We are by no means the only group doing that, but it's more than just call your legislator all the time, right? That should be happening, but there are really strategic actions, many of which never see the light of day, right? When we're opposing something which is easy, as you say, that often happens behind the scenes, but this is going to require a tidal wave of support like we've never seen in generations. And I think that is a tidal wave that we need, so that we can look back in 10 years and say, we are proud of what we've done. We didn't just avert catastrophe, but we made a better, more inclusive, happier, healthier world.
Thank you. I'm excited to keep working with you guys.
Yeah.
All right, guys, so we'll wrap up there. Thank you all so much for coming tonight. It really means a lot. And if you all could just give one more round of applause for Ben and Kevin here. And feel free to peruse the tables on your way out. All these organizations are doing really great work, but more than anything, just your participation here has meant the world. So thank you again.